Welcome to another wonderful Susannah Calloway audiobook. We are excited to have you with us. Before we begin the story, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. This allows us to continue adding free clean Western romance audiobooks for you to enjoy. The following title is copyrighted by Susannah Calloway, Western romance author. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and enjoy the story. The Redeemed Swindler Bride. Chapter 1. John liked going to church. He didn't know of a person who didn't like going to church on Sundays. After worship, it was a good time to greet the townspeople and get caught up. But for him, it was different. John was the preacher's son. The church was as much home to him as the house he'd slept in all his life. However, "We don't want to let go of him yet," John's father said, an odd sort of twist to his usually stern mouth. He was talking to one of the neighbors, Mrs. Perkins, who was listening intently. "John will probably stay home helping us for another year before he follows me into the ministry." John could do nothing but shrug when the woman turned to him. However, John's love for the church didn't mean he wanted to be a preacher. His relationship to God wasn't like that. He wasn't his father, and he could pray just fine as a regular fellow. John wanted to be a rancher. They were in the West, where the land stretched for eternity. But how could he tell his father that? "I know you'll make a perfect preacher," Mrs. Perkins assured him, beaming. She was a kind woman, and John didn't want to disappoint her. And he didn't dare disappoint his overbearing, unbending father. How could John ever tell him that the future he saw for his son wasn't what his son wanted, that what John wanted to do was trade the church for hard work with cattle on the land? "My son doesn't want to be a preacher," Mrs. Perkins continued, turning back to John's father. "I don't know how to talk to him anymore, preacher. He won't listen to his own mother." "It'll be all right," John's father reassured her, putting a hand on her shoulder. "He's still young. He just needs time to grow. And not all young men are called into the ministry." It wasn't as if John didn't appreciate his father's work. He liked people, and he liked hearing about their lives and knowing his father had helped them, that his father had shouldered some of the burdens people carried, but it still wasn't the life he wanted. "John. There you are. I've been looking for you, young man." John turned around at the sound of his mother's voice and blanched when he saw who it was she had on her arm, Lily Johnson, the Johnsons' youngest girl, blonde-haired and blue-eyed like an angel. She was quiet and demure, a shy little thing with the voice of a songbird in the church's choir. John's mother desperately wanted him to marry her and bring forth a dozen blonde grandchildren. But John wanted more than anything to run away whenever he saw the young woman. Oh, she wasn't lovely enough. But John wasn't the sort of man who liked a woman who was so shy she couldn't utter a single word to him. He had the feeling Lily would be the precise sort of quiet, dutiful wife every man wanted, but it all seemed so boring to him. Why have a wife you couldn't even talk to properly? A preacher's life, if he got saddled with it, was already going to be boring enough. "Look who I found while looking for you," his mother said with a smile, patting Lily's hand where it rested on the crook of her elbow. "Doesn't Lily look beautiful today, John?" Yes," John said with a strained smile. Lily blushed, her eyes veering downward. John was glad for the opportunity not to have to look at her. "I was just telling her," his mother went on, blissfully unaware or just how awkward things were between them, "that what with being involved in the church already, Lily would make a wonderful preacher's wife, don't you think?" How on earth am I supposed to answer that? John wondered, a bit desperate. "I'm sure Lily will make, whoever she marries very happy," he managed, then tried to change the subject immediately. "Ma, I'm pretty sure Dad was just looking for you. Why don't you go see what he's wanting?" "Oh, of course," his mother said, delighted. "Why don't you take Lily's hand from me and entertain her while I really need to, go out and see what my, friend is doing. I have a feeling he's been hollering for me," John blurted out, awkward and desperate. "I'll be going now. Nice seeing you, Lily." He fled. "I don't understand why you don't like her, Jake Jennings," John's best friend who had indeed been waiting for him outside the church, commented. They walked around together, enjoying the day. I mean, I guess I get not wanting a boring wife, but she is a beautiful girl. John groaned. Jake, don't you get it? John begged. I bet your parents haven't got a wife picked out for you like you're a baby who can't pick someone for yourself. It's like my folks think I'm 2 years old, and I don't get to decide anything for myself. My mother's got my girl picked out, and my father's got my profession picked out. I swear I don't get to decide which shirt I wear for the day, 'cause I wake up and these two have my clothes picked out, too. Jake laughed, because he truly didn't understand John's misery. Don't you worry, those things work out, Jake reassured him, clapping him on the shoulder. Someday they'll realize you're an adult, and that you want a disobedient, mouthy, ugly woman for a wife. I want none of that. John said, offended. Is it so bad to want a wife who can at least look me in the face? Jake just laughed, and John sighed. The truth was, all John had ever wanted was what Jake Jennings had, a life out on a ranch. Jake was going to inherit the ranch from his father, and John couldn't believe his friend's luck. Maybe they could trade places. Jake, who was ambivalent toward his future and content to do as he was told, could go on to become a preacher, and John could work the ranch instead. Don't be so sour-faced, Jake said, swinging an arm around John's shoulders. If you're so keen on taking care of the cows and waking up before the sun to feed the chickens, why don't you come visit me for a while? The ranch needs a cowhand, you know. I don't think your parents would mind you coming to work for us for a while. If nothing else, it'll show them you're thinking about the future, right? I'd like nothing more. Jake shook his head, amused, and John walked on with a lighter heart. It'd do him good to spend some time on the ranch, he thought. He could see firsthand the life he wanted and get away from his parents for a few weeks. Jake left him after a while, going to the cafe with his folks. John could have gone with him, but he felt like walking around a bit, to gather his thoughts. He thought about what he should pack for the trip to the ranch, about what his chores would be. He would be happy to help the Jennings. He knew Mr. Jennings, Jake's father, needed a good deal of help, since the ranch was too big for just him and his son to work, but there weren't many folks floating around town looking for ranch hand work. John was so deep in thought that he almost didn't see the McCoy gang making their way to his side. They weren't really a gang, just 3 young men who drank too much and had too little to do with their days. John had known them all his life and didn't much care for them. But they were always looking for what they thought was an easy target. Hey, preacher boy, McCoy called out. John froze for a second, then continued walking with his shoulders hunched. He didn't turn around. He wouldn't pay them any mind, they would only get worse. The 3 of them started to laugh uproariously, as if John not talking to them was the most hilarious thing in the world. John walked faster, but not fast enough. McCoy ran up and wound a heavy arm around his shoulders, his foul breath close to John's face. You ignorant us, preacher boy. You really can't afford to. You're such a weakling, look at ya. I bet you've never worked a day in your cursed life. Of course, I have. John retaliated, affronted. I'm not a mooch like some I know. I wouldn't leave my parents to deal with everything alone. He shouldn't have opened his mouth. The 3 of them laughed again, but John had hit home. Their insults turned dark, insulting John's folks, the preacher and his wife. Calling them names no proper person should ever be called. John felt rage boil in his heart, and it took all his willpower to refrain from retaliating to their taunts. He refused to lower himself to their level. Still, they were far stronger than him, and he couldn't dislodge McCoy's arm from around his shoulders. He couldn't do anything as they led him toward the saloon, laughing and mocking him as they went. John struggled but couldn't get free. He felt weak and stupid, and tried again to break McCoy's hold. What is it? Rodgers said, his voice slurred and mocking. Why were you trying to leave, preacher boy? You should be thankin' us. We's helping you. Dean hollered from his other side. Today, McCoy said, jokingly serious, you become a man, John Rodgers. I bet you're such a little boy that you ain't never been to the saloon. How sorry. John felt himself burn with humiliation. It wasn't like he could go around drinking and going to the saloon, not with his father being the preacher. People would talk, and John would never do anything to disrespect his parents, no matter how pathetic McCoy and his goons thought he was. They planted him down on a seat by the bar and John tried to stand up again, but was immediately pressed and held down. He tried to catch the eye of the man who was tending bar, but he wouldn't look him in the face, and John had no help at all while McCoy ordered a tall glass of whiskey. I'm not going to drink anything, John said firmly. I have work to do. Shut up about work, McCoy barked out, and shoved the drink at John's face. Drink up this glass, Rodgers, and prove to us you're not the weakling everyone thinks you are. I don't have to prove anything to you. John sputtered, shoving McCoy away. It was a bad idea, since McCoy was still holding the glass. When McCoy was jerked away, the glass slipped out of his hand, spilling its contents over John's shirt and trousers. McCoy and his two friends roared with laughter, and John felt his face go up in humiliated flames. As if John hadn't suffered enough, the saloon girls decided to join in on the fun. They walked up to the group, laughing with mirth, and started to smother John's face in kisses. John shoved them away, wiping his face to try and get rid of their oily, too bright lip paint, and in the confusion, managed to dislodge McCoy's arm from around his shoulders. Glad he was free, and that McCoy was distracted with the girls, he fled the saloon. He didn't care about the people laughing, about what people would say, he was just glad to be out. Now he would need to go home and change his clothes. He stank of perfume and whiskey, and he felt disgusting. He lifted his gaze and caught the shocked eyes of his father, who was standing a few doors down the street. John felt his heart drop to his stomach. Oh, no, he thought, mortified. He thought about how much explaining he would have to do, and how unlikely it was that his father would believe him, and suddenly it was too much. John didn't want to do any part of it. He didn't want to explain. He didn't want to assure his father that he was the dutiful son who would do exactly as he was told and thus have a miserable, unhappy life. He was done pretending to be someone he wasn't. He met his father's disappointed, shocked gaze defiantly. Then he turned and simply walked away. Chapter 2. What in God's name happened to you? Jake exclaimed, shocked, when John finally managed to hunt his friend down. You smell like the saloon. I thought you'd never went there, John, and now you stink like you've just left after living there for a week. Don't tell me that, John said with a groan. He led Jake away from the diner where he had been finishing lunch with his parents. He certainly didn't want the Jennings to see him like this. What happened? Jake asked him again, worried. He took a kerchief from his pocket and gave it to John so he could wipe some of the whiskey off himself. John cleaned his face, glad he had Jake as a friend. He'd still need to haul out the metal tub and take a bath and change his clothes, but just this small swipe made him feel better. It was the McCoy gang, John said in a bitter murmur. They took me to the saloon and finally when I managed to escape, I walked out, and my father was standing almost right in front of me. You don't know how awful that was. Though honestly, Jake, I was a bit relieved. Relieved? Jake's brow rose. If nothing else, it was an opening to get away from my parents and do what I want for once. My dad will probably be glad to see me leave now, John told him. I want to strike out on my own. Try to build something with my own hands. You invited me to stay on your ranch for a little while. I'm accepting your offer. You said your father needs a cowhand, right? My father will be happy to have someone to help, Jake said, but are you sure? For all you've said about wanting to be a rancher, you've never actually done anything to get there. Why start now? I'm ready, John exclaimed, throwing his hands up. I'm tired of the way things are, and it's about time for me to do something about it. Jake nodded. Well, I'm not that happy about slighting the town's preacher, but I'd do anything for you. I'll talk to Pa. John smiled back, lightly punching Jake's shoulder. Jake shoved him away, laughing. Don't touch me. You still stink. Come on, let's go. I'll explain it all to my pa, why you want to work for him. I'm sure he'll understand. Then, I'll get word to you. Fine. They walked to the cafe, and John waited outside while Jake spoke to his parents. While standing there under the sun, John caught sight of his mother as she walked down the main street. She was holding on to her husband's arm, and a horrified expression rose to her face when she spotted him on the other side of the street. John caught her gaze, then looked away. They walked on without trying to talk to him. Later that evening, John told them his plans. Neither of his parents were on board with the idea, but John held his ground. Finally, in exasperation, his dad stormed out of the house, and stood on the front porch like a frozen sapling for a very long time. His mother sat in the rocker in the front room, sniffing into her handkerchief whenever he was close enough to hear her. John couldn't wait to get out of there. Life at the ranch was good. People always said that things were never as good as one thought, that dreams were never as perfect as people imagined, but John's experience was the opposite. The ranch was wide, expansive, and filled with life, from the Jennings family to the cattle and the horses and the chickens and the goats, and John loved it all. Jake's parents had accepted his story readily and were happy he was there to help. Every day, Mrs. Jennings thanked him with his favorite breakfast of eggs, potatoes, bacon, and bread. John drank a full mug of coffee and bit into the freshly baked loaf of bread in front of him. He was a happy young man. It's good when a man has a good appetite, Mrs. Jennings said with beaming approval, as she set another slice of bread in front of him. All of us have a lot of work to do today, and it won't do for any of you to pass out from hunger in the middle of it. Jake groaned. Ma, that happened once. John and Mr. Jennings laughed, then Mr. Jennings stood up, finished with breakfast. John didn't feel bad about lingering around the table a little while longer, since Jake was still there, too. Speaking of work, boy, Mr. Jennings said, snatching a letter that had been sitting on the counter. He gave it to John. This arrived for you today, and it's from your folks, so you do well to read it before you start the day. I wouldn't want it to slip your mind that I gave it to you. A letter? His folks had written him a letter? John looked at the envelope in his hands. Thanks, Mr. Jennings. I already told you to call me Edward. He's a polite young man, Mrs. Jennings cut in. Go on out to work, Edward. I'll send these two when they're done with breakfast. John didn't pay attention to their conversation, focusing instead on the letter in his hands. He opened it and quickly scanned its contents. Dear Johnny. You don't know what you're doing to your poor mother. You come back home right now. Haven't you been there long enough? I invited dear Lily Johnson for a dinner at the end of the week, and you should be here. There's still time to fix this. You know me, and your father will understand everything once you explain it all to us. I still don't understand why you didn't explain it before you left in the first place. I know, my son. And I know you wouldn't be going to that saloon regular, like people are saying. People in town have been talking. You know how they are, spending their days doing nothing but gossiping. It makes your father downright angry. He's a preacher, a man of God, and he has an image to protect. You can't just do this kind of thing and disappear. But I spoke to him, so don't you worry about him, son. He's calmer now. You can come home, and we'll all talk together and figure things out. Remember the dinner with Lily. I've already gotten you a nice new shirt for it. With love. Your mother. The paper crumpled in his grip. His mother hadn't contacted him for weeks, and now that she finally sent him a letter, it was to tell him to come back. As if he had run away instead of coming here to work a job. She didn't respect him or his decisions at all. Bad news then? Mrs. Jennings asked, her expression anxious. John shook his head. Nah. Just, well, nothing. Mrs. Jennings looked at the wadded ball of paper in his hand. Now, boy, don't you destroy your letter like that, she chastised gently. He blinked up at her, surprised. That there is a letter from your folks. Go drink some coffee outside and clear your head. Take the newspaper, we just got it yesterday. Your folks love you, Johnny, and I know they mean well. Jake sent him a sympathetic look. John didn't want to slack off work, but he didn't want to ignore his host's suggestion either. Truth was, he thought he'd like reading the newspaper and enjoying the morning air for a while. He got up and went to do as he was told. He wouldn't be long and would go straight to work after his cup of coffee. And he'd wait until evening to write his mother back and politely decline her invitation. He sat down on the bench outside and opened the paper. It was just happenstance, luck, one might say, that his eyes were immediately drawn to a mail-order bride advert. He couldn't help but read it, his eyes scanning the page until he had read all the adverts, and suddenly he knew what he was going to do. It was a foolish thing. Perhaps another act of rebellion against his parents, who so wanted him to marry the woman they'd chosen for him. But one particular advert had drawn his eye like a moth to a flame, and he was helpless. Brianna McCarthy, green eyes and red hair, 20 years old. A city girl who can do all the chores of a house and quickly learn how to work on a ranch or a field. Traveling from New York City, eager to travel to the West. There was something strangely honest about it, something that called to him. He gulped down the last of his coffee and made his decision. Brianna stood on the street with all her belongings in her hands, of which there weren't many. She conned men for a living. It was a strangely noble sort of work. The men with whom she stayed were usually evil, godless and prone to violence, or sometimes simply lazy. Often, they were cheaters or gamblers. More than once, she found herself with men who spent more time with the saloon girls than at home. All in all, she had never felt too much guilt over her line of work. She felt like they were all deserving of the ruin she brought to their door. Still, she had never thought Wilbur would be one of them. Of course, he was bad. He was the one who worked with her, who got her into this line of work in the first place. He was the man who found her crying on the street at the tender age of 15, filled with grief over her parents' death and full of terror at what life would hold for a new orphan like her. He'd decided to make her into someone who could take money from men faster than they could figure out how she'd done it. He was no good and an outlaw, and he'd probably annoyed enough people to be hunted down by bounty hunters around most parts. Brianna was no fool, she had always known this. But she never thought he would double-cross her. Brianna had just pulled off her most lucrative job, and she figured she and Wilbur would live like royalty for months to come, if not for the rest of their lives. Her target had worked at a bank and had more money than Brianna ever hoped to even see in one life. He'd fallen right into her trap like the pathetic thing he was. It had been easy, and she had laughed with Wilbur about it more than once. She thought the two of them would have something real good for once. A few months of respite. Instead, the cursed man had taken the first train out to God knew where and had left her without a roof over her head, without most of her clothes, and without money enough to even rent a room for more than a week. She wanted her money, but it wasn't like she would die without it. She had learned a lot in the past 5 years she had worked with Wilbur, and she was a smart woman. She could more than do the job alone, and she was even happy that for once she would get to have the spoils all to herself. But the betrayal smarted, and she felt stupid and alone as she stood on the street with a half-filled bag by her feet and nothing else to call her own. She was again a poor orphan standing alone by the side of a street, though her tears had long since dried. Dear Lord, she wondered, what will I do? She shouldn't have trusted a man, not even the one who had taken her in, taught her and housed her and fed her for years. Men were all just jobs, she thought to herself, just money. She couldn't even begrudge him for stealing from her when the truth was that she should never have trusted him in the first place. She should have stolen from him first. That would have taught him but good. She started to walk, no destination in mind. She didn't even remember the name of the town she was in, but that wasn't a problem. It was somewhere near New York, that she knew. Brianna could deal by herself, all she needed to do was find another man. There was no shortage of fools in the world for her to trick. Wandering down the street, she happened across a strange building. It was tall and lean, and through the windows, she could see a group of women gathered. The front of it read Blackwell Mail Order Bride Agency. A satisfied smile slowly stretched her lips. Looking at that sign, an idea bloomed in her mind. She and Wilbur had used mail-order bride adverts before to find their marks, though usually Wilbur preferred to ferret out their victims by hand. The point was, Brianna had done this before, and she knew just what to do now. This was an easy way to find a place to stay, preferably with a man from whom she could steal a few things. She walked into the building, a plan forming and shaping itself in her mind. Chapter 3. Brianna was more than relieved once the train finally arrived in Montana. Traveling alone after so many years of traveling with someone else was strangely nerve-wracking, and the trip had taken a longer time than she was used to. But she had wanted to leave the place she had been when Wilbur left her with nothing, so this was just as well. She exited the train and walked to the train station, where she started to look around, looking for the man she had chosen as her next target. She didn't know much about him, since the agency she had used did a lot of the work of mediating between the parties, but she knew he was a young, tall man with brown hair and eyes. It wasn't hard to find him, in the end. He was holding up a card with her name. She made her way to him, and when she got closer, she found herself surprised by how handsome he was. Some people would find brown hair and eyes boring, but they were striking on him. His hair shone almost golden under the sun streaming through the branches, swept back and away from his pleasing face. He had thick eyebrows over his eyes, which were a dark chocolate color. He had a square, kind face, and a sweetly nervous smile on his full lips. His cheeks were reddened by the sun, his arms tanned. "Hello," Brianna said, a bit wrong-footed. Usually, the men she went after weren't so young and handsome. "Hello, Brianna," the man, John Rodgers, said. His voice was deep and pleasant, like he didn't know her but already liked her. "Here, let me hold your bag for you." "It's nice to meet you. I'm John Rodgers." "I mean, you already knew that, but..." Brianna shook her head, strangely charmed. "I'm Brianna McCarthy," she told him. "I know that," John said with a small laugh. "Well, I was just being polite, Mr. Rodgers," Brianna said, putting a hand on her waist. "I didn't mean to be rude, Miss McCarthy," John replied, strangely pleased that she had talked back at him. "Pull yourself together," Brianna told herself, following him as he made from the station. "If you want your plan to work, you can't go around being charmed by random pretty men." He was just another helpless target. Once she had successfully pulled off the con, it would be time to move on. It was how it had to be. She had to be smart, and she would be a fool to trust a man ever again. She was glad that for once she hadn't ended up with a much older man who would definitely already have a woman somewhere on the side. John turned around and smiled at her. "Would you like to pass by the diner and have a cool drink before we go?" he asked. "If I were you, I'd be dying for something to drink, and maybe even something to eat. Of course, there's plenty of supplies back at the ranch, but I wanted to treat you. Why don't we go?" Brianna smiled at him and told herself firmly that she didn't find him sweet and considerate at all. They arrived at the ranch a little while later, and Brianna was very impressed by its size. Susie Blackwell, the owner of the agency she'd used to find Mr. John Rodgers, had assured her that she had been set up with a very wealthy rancher, so much so that there had been an extra fee involved. Brianna was glad that the facts were true and that her last bits of money had been well spent. It was a bit strange that a man so young as John would have a ranch this big, but Brianna wasn't looking a gift horse in the mouth. A couple met them at the door of the big house, perhaps John's parents? Though he didn't look much like them. Brianna and John approached them, and John beamed proudly at them as he introduced her. "Mr. and Mrs. Jennings, please meet Miss Brianna McCarthy," he said, gesturing to her. "She's the woman I spoke about, from the mail-order bride advert." What kind of man refers to his parents by their last names? She wondered, then remembered that he was John Rodgers, not Jennings. What was going on? Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. A young man of around John's age was standing by the older couple, and it was obvious they were related. He had the man's blonde hair and the woman's brown eyes. He was sending John startled looks, as if surprised with Brianna's beauty. Brianna eyed them all, confused. "I've already told you to call us Edward and Lydia, boy," Mr. Jennings scolded, amused and familiar. He turned to Brianna. "It's nice to meet you, Miss McCarthy. It's good to have you here. John told us a bit about you, and we know you're going to be a good addition to this house and this ranch. And this is Jake Jennings, their son and my best friend," John told her, gesturing to the man standing beside the couple. "They're the ones who own the ranch, of course. I'm a cowhand here. They're very good, kind people. I know you'll like them." Brianna stared at him, shocked, and felt her face turn pale. John frowned at her, worried. "Brianna, are you okay? Your face just went white as a snowstorm." I'm well," she assured him in a breathy voice, lifting a hand to her bosom. Don't you worry about me, Mr. Rodgers. I'm getting you some water," Lydia said, worried, and dashed further into the house to do so. "It must be the sun," Mr. Jennings said. "John said you're a city girl, and we know the sun is hard here in the West. Let's get you inside." They herded her in and she went easily, too startled to do anything else. That wicked Mrs. Susie Blackwell had tricked her, she realized. Brianna put a hand on her forehead and forced a smile. So. The con woman had been conned. How awful. How bad had Brianna been faring that she had been tricked twice in the span of a week? She was pathetic. At the same time, she wasn't the kind of woman to linger over disappointments and mistakes. She drank the water Lydia brought her and now smiled winningly at John, who hovered anxiously by her side. "I'm just fine," she said firmly. "Stop fretting, Mr. Rodgers. I'm simply a woman and used to such long trips, and Mr. Jennings was right that I'm not used to all this sun and the heat. Why don't you show me where I'm to sleep?" John smiled again, looking relieved and for some reason pleased with her brusque manners. Brianna had never really found a man who thought so. They always seemed to think she should be more a statue than a woman, quiet and obedient. "Here, girl, I'll show you around," Lydia said, stepping up to her side. "We have a room where you can stay while you and our dear John court. Now, let me take that bag for you. The men will go back to work now. Off you boys go, we'll see you later." The men groaned and laughed but went easily. John gave her one last look before he went. Brianna followed Lydia and decided that she was going to make the best of the situation. She was nothing if not an industrious woman, and there was always a way to turn things to her advantage. She'd play along with these people for now and think up of another plan as she went. "Wow," Jake said for about the fourth time since they'd stepped out to feed the horses. "I know," John said dazedly. Brianna McCarty was about the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. Even now while he was working, he couldn't stop seeing her in his mind, like an afterimage of the sun after he'd stared at it for too long. She was shorter than he was by just a little bit, with fair skin and a braid of flaming red hair, as stunning as it was loud. It demanded attention, like she did, all of her, from her emerald green eyes and her straight, confident posture, to her confidence in her firm words. She was breathtaking. "I think I will go looking at those mail-order bride adverts now," Jake said, shaking his head ruefully. "Unless you're just one lucky man." "I sure am," John said with a pleased smile. He patted a horse's flank and wondered if Brianna would like to ride with him that afternoon, if she wasn't too tired. He was happy he had responded to the advert and grateful to the agency that had brought Brianna to him. He just couldn't wait to see his mother's reaction. He could bet she never imagined her son with an unafraid, proud Irish woman by his side instead of shy, demure little Lily Johnson. "But luck only goes so far," Jake continued, growing more sober. "You should be more careful, John. I can see you're half in love already, and what if this doesn't work?" "I'm not going to go into this thinkin' it won't work," John told his friend. "That'll ruin it from the start." Jake rolled his eyes, clearly worried, but let him be. John wouldn't contact his parents again before they contacted him, but he was eager for it. Chapter 4. Brianna wasn't impressed when Lydia assigned her a sizable share of the daily chores around the ranch. She had never gone after men who would put her to such heavy work. But if she were to fit the part, she had no choice but to comply. The truth she didn't want to admit to herself was that life on the ranch seemed strangely appealing to her. She had never thought she could ever fit the part of a rancher's wife, but there was something about the West and its people that seemed genuine and solid to a city girl who had lived her whole life playing cons. She and Lydia grew closer as they worked, and Brianna's work had a good physicality to it, a satisfying immediacy. She washed the kitchen and the space was then clean. She learned to knead bread and make stew, and then there was good food to eat. She washed and hung the clothes, and then they were dry, smelling like grass and sun. And all the while, she caught sight of John in the distance, suntanned and sweating, sending a smile her way whenever he spotted her. "Tomorrow," Lydia told her after finished heating up water for a bath, "I'll teach you how to make a good chicken pie." Brianna found herself excited for the next day, for seeing John's face when he took his first bite. She knew he would tell her it was wonderful no matter what, and it warmed her heart. "Don't be stupid," she told herself harshly, even as she sent Lydia a smile. "You can't get sidetracked. Going along with John's courting is just a way to buy time before you figure out my next move." She would continue looking at other mail-order bride adverts until she found another man, she figured. She needed another target, and a truly wealthy one this time. She was still peeved she'd allowed herself to be swindled. She would make her situation even worse by lingering on this ranch. She had just enough money left for a train ticket, which she would use to go somewhere else when another appropriately rich man answered an advert of hers. There was no point wasting too much time there when she should be pouring all her energy into planning where she would go and what she would do in her next con. "Dear Brianna, why don't you go ahead and take your bath while I go call the men back for dinner?" Lydia offered, kindly. "You seem a bit tired, and I know a hot bath will be good for you. Stay and rest a bit." "Thank you, Lydia," Brianna said with a smile, and for the first time in years, she felt guilt like a vine twisting around her heart. A few weeks passed, and Brianna grew more and more frazzled. "Here," John told her with a smile, pushing his glass full of freshly made berry juice to her. "I noticed you liked it, so you can have mine." "John, that's not necessary," she told him a bit desperately. "I made it for you, and each one of us has only this one glass. Don't go wasting yours on me." "It is necessary if it will make you happy," he told her sincerely, not a lick of malice or mocking in his voice, and Brianna was utterly powerless against it. "All right," she said with a sigh, bringing the glass closer to herself. Dinner time was the worst. Breakfast tended to be brief, and Lydia would often take lunch out to the men as they worked, so dinner was the one time of the day everyone sat down together for a meal and conversation. Brianna was simply not used to the genuineness of the folk and their appreciation of something as simple as time spent in each other's company during a meal. This kind of thing had always been a game to her. She always had to learn everything about whatever man she was trying to trick, figuring out how much she had to lean toward him, which smile to give him, what little comment to make. But it wasn't like that on the Jennings ranch. John smiled at her no matter what she did. She could, and had more than once, snap at him and feign annoyance or anger, and he would immediately back down, asking her for forgiveness. He was simply a kind man. So her ploys of not getting too close to him were for naught. Knowing that she was keeping a dark secret from these kind people was becoming a heavier burden on her by the day. "I have to say, it's like your cooking is gettin' better every day," Mr. Jennings told his wife with a fond shake of his head. She swatted his arm with a towel, flushing in pleasure and embarrassment. "Oh, shush, Ed. You're the one who works harder every day. You come home hungrier and hungrier, you're going to eat us out of hearth and home." "I have a healthy appetite," Mr. Jennings exclaimed. "You eat enough for 3 men, Pa," Jake joked with a smile. Mr. Jennings gave him a playful glare and kicked him under the table. "I work like I'm 3 men, too, young man." They all laughed, even Brianna, helpless in the face of such clear affection. "What about you, Brianna?" Lydia asked, curious. "What about your family? I wonder what I would think if my daughter moved so far away from me," if I had a daughter, of course. Brianna winced. She opened her mouth to lie and somehow found herself being honest, no matter how much she disliked speaking about what happened to her family. My parents were Irish, she started hesitantly, her eyes on the table. I am, too, you know. We came from Ireland when I was 10. We lived in the cities, never on a ranch like this, but they're not here anymore. So, they haven't got much to think of me doing this kind of thing. Or the kind of thing I'm actually doing, she thought to herself. Truth was, they would be very disappointed in her. Oh, you poor dear, Lydia said, heartfelt. John put his hand on top of hers on the table and squeezed it. Brianna, I'm so sorry, he said softly. Somehow, it made her feel stronger. She straightened up and gave him a smile. They died when I was 15 of influenza, and I've been making my way these past 5 years. But don't you fret, John. I'm not the only orphan in the world and life has to go on. Tears don't put food on the table. Oh, but you shouldn't have had to be alone for so long, Lydia said. Brianna turned from John to her and was startled when she saw tears in Lydia's eyes. Her mouth opened in shock. How could this woman be so genuine, so open with her empathy? Brianna felt shame and guilt down to her very bones. But she also felt relieved. Relieved that they weren't telling her to move on, that they were crying and grieving with her. Brianna felt herself loosen up, shed some of her hard shell. John threaded their fingers together and she gave him a wobbly, but true smile. I suppose, she said softly. You aren't alone anymore, John told her. Despite everything, it warmed her heart. Hey, John called. Brianna turned around. She was in the kitchen, kneading bread for breakfast the next morning. It wasn't the hardest work, but Lydia had felt too bad after hearing Brianna's story to put her to too much work. Brianna was glad that she could do something with her hands and be alone. Though she didn't mind that John was there. Hello, John, she said. Do you need anything? I think we have some light food put away somewhere here if you're too hungry to wait. No, I'm okay, he said, quick to reassure her. He walked closer, peering into her hands' work. Are you making bread? I say, you women have stronger hands than we men do, with how much bread you make. Don't tease, she said, swatting at his shoulder and smacking his shirt with flour. You know I wouldn't have a tenth of the strength needed to be a cowhand. Now are you here for something or did you just come to linger? Well. You came to linger, she exclaimed, amused. Are you trying to get out of work, Mr. Rodgers? I will tattle on you, boy, see if I don't. No, don't tattle. John answered, laughing. When he smiled, crinkles appeared beside his eyes, and Brianna was having a hard time not focusing on how charming they were. Truth is, I was just about to get properly dressed for the day when I heard this beautiful voice whistling. Brianna looked away, bashful. I'm sorry to bother you, she said. I didn't even realize I was whistling. It wasn't a bother, John told her, reaching to hold her hand even though it was full of dough. It was lovely. It went something like. He started to whistle. It was a sweet, soft song, and Brianna instantly recognized it. It was one old Irish song her mama used to sing softly while she cooked in the mornings, the kind of song a person could just about move their bodies to. Oh, Brianna said. That's one of my mama's songs. I didn't even know I remembered it. John grinned at her, pleased, and with his hold on her hand, he drew her away from the counter and to the center of the kitchen. He kept on whistling, though it was obvious he didn't know how the song went and just started to invent any random melody. Brianna rolled her eyes but went easily. He smiled and caught her waist with his other hand, and out of nowhere he twirled her about the room. Brianna gasped, holding on to him, and he laughed at her reaction. You act like you've danced before, he said. Well, I've never danced around in a kitchen, she answered, though the words lacked her usual bite. She averted her face away from him, suddenly shy. You stop this right now, Mr. Rodgers, and let me go back to my work. What would Lydia say if she saw us here? John laughed, delighted, and leaned very close to her indeed. Mrs. Jennings is by the doorway, Brianna, and she's been smiling at us for a few minutes already, he murmured. Oh, that woman, Brianna muttered back. It's like she wants to have more work. We should stop and go tell her to stop spying on us. John just shook his head and went back to whistling. He clearly didn't have enough coordination to dance properly, but it was just as sweet for him to swing her slowly from side to side around the room, uncaring that there was flour everywhere or that she was stepping on his feet. Brianna was utterly taken with the simplicity and truthfulness of this man, of this preacher's son, or so she had been told by Mrs. Jennings, who spoke of God like he was a neighbor, and who danced like the songs of her home country and her childhood had been made for him alone. She, who spent her whole life conning people and surrounded by awful men, thought suddenly that John would never trick her. John would never abandon her or give her anything less than the entirety of his heart. You should call me John, he said suddenly, and she saw there was some pink on his cheeks. Mr. Rodgers is my father, Brianna. It makes me feel very weird when you call me that. She sighed. All right, she said. John. He blushed, and she found herself giggling at the sight. Chapter 5. So, Jake said very carefully to John one evening after they were just done herding the cows. Don't be angry with me now, but there's a new letter from your folks to you. John's mood instantly soured. He looked at his friend, a scowl on his face. Why would I be angry with you? Because last time you got a letter from them, you weren't too keen about working afterward. So I hid this one from you until we were mostly done for the day. John rolled his eyes and laughed. I'm glad you didn't let me read it in the morning. But I'm eager to get a letter from my parents. I'm wanting to introduce them to Brianna. Come on, give it to me. Jake passed it on to him, and John quickly opened it. It was very much shorter than the last letter, which was somewhat surprising. It contained very little, a small apology and another invitation for dinner, now without any mention of women and without any trying to guilt him into coming back home for sure. Well? Same old stuff? Jake asked. Not really. John said, happy and glad for it. I think they've finally accepted my decision to be here. I need something to write on. I'll write it on the back of this letter and send it right away. Well, I don't have no stationery with me, Jake said with a chuckle. We'll go back to the house, and you can write your reply like a decent person. Were you raised in a barn? He laughed at his own joke. Fine. You're right. Off we go. They walked back to the house and the first thing John did was sit down at the table to write his reply. He made it as short as the letter he'd received, figuring they wouldn't be upset with him not writing much since they hadn't written much either. Dear Ma. I'm glad you wrote to me. I'll be sure to be there this Friday. I have someone I want you two to meet. I think you'll like her. Your son. John. He quickly folded the paper. What's that? Brianna asked over his shoulder. It's a letter to my folks, John told her, turning to grin up at her. We aren't really speaking, haven't been ever since I came to live here on the ranch, but they sent me a letter and I'm replying. They asked me to have dinner with them this Friday, and I'd like for you to go with me. Brianna's face fell. Oh. He frowned up at her, finding her reaction strange. Maybe because the invitation made her think of her own parents. Brianna? Are you all right? I'm fine, she said, waving his thoughts away, though he noticed she didn't look back at him. I'm just tired from work and of course nervous about meeting your folks. But it'll be all right. I need to get back at it, there's work to be done. She hurried away. John looked at her as she went, a bit puzzled, but he was sure everything was fine. He turned back to his letter and smiled. He couldn't wait to see his parents' reaction. Brianna fled to the barn while John lingered in the house, talking about his letter and the dinner with his parents to anyone who might listen. It was becoming more and more difficult for Brianna to keep up her pretense. She sat down on a wooden crate inside the barn and put her head in her hands. She was a fool. She was letting this all go too far. She needed to focus. She was waiting for a reply to a missive she had sent to a wealthy rancher in Texas, and she hoped for the best. That was what she needed to concentrate on, and yet now John wanted to introduce her to his parents and Brianna was drowning in guilt. It was not a familiar emotion for her, and she found it quite to her distaste. Plus, she didn't know what to do with it. She hadn't wanted to, but the truth was that she was developing feelings for John she had never felt before, and it was all as confusing as it was nerve-wracking. She found herself not wanting to leave. She didn't know how much longer she could keep up this charade. She squeezed her eyes shut against the tears that wanted to escape. What an idiot she had been. But there was no way to get out of this dinner. There was no way to get out of this situation. And she wasn't about to let herself trust these people. Not really trust them. She wasn't going to go down that road. John thought that Brianna was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen from the first moment he had seen her, and that was when she just disembarked from the train after hours and hours of traveling with common and comfortable clothes. Now she exited her room and made her way to the front door with her red hair up and her curvaceous body clad in a dark green dress that seemed to have been tailored for her, even though it was some old thing Mrs. Jennings had lent her for the day. John felt his heart stop in his chest. Breathtaking, he had thought on that day he met Brianna, and he thought it again right now. "Wow," Jake said next to him. "Wow," John repeated. "What are you staring at me for, John?" Brianna asked, a flush on her cheeks. She put her hands on her hips. "Close your mouth and let's go. Your parents will hate me if we get there late." John closed his mouth and swallowed. "Yes, okay." Chapter 6. "Johnny," his mother said warmly, drawing him into a tearful hug, "it's been so long. Goodness, but you're so tanned. You've been out in the sun too much." "I work on a ranch, Ma," he said, a bit flustered that his mother had hugged him like that in front of Brianna. "Hello, son," his father said quietly, and clapped him on the shoulder. "Hello," John said, then smiled and gestured at Brianna. "I'd like you two to meet Brianna McCarty, who lives at the ranch with me." He wanted to say more, but he found himself unwilling to say anything without talking to Brianna beforehand. They hadn't really spoken about the reason she was there, the mail-order bride advert or how they were courting. They had never kissed. But his parents weren't stupid people. Surely, they would know what it meant, that John had brought Brianna over. Obviously, they knew, since the smile his mother sent Brianna was chilly at best. "It's nice to meet you, Miss McCarty," she said, then immediately turned to John again. "Let's all walk in. Dinner is just about ready. I just stepped out for a second." "All right," John said, sending Brianna an apologetic look. Brianna looked a bit upset, but a bit annoyed, too, which was reassuring to John. Maybe not many men would have liked that, but for him it meant that she wasn't too intimidated by her parents' first impression. They were all ushered in. John felt comfortable in the familiar house, glad to be back home for a little while. It wasn't that the Jennings house wasn't nice, too, but there was just something different about being in your childhood home. John, Brianna, and John's father sat down at the table while his mother bustled away to the kitchen, though she quickly came back with hot plates in her hands. Behind her, helping her with a jar full of ice water, walked Lily Johnson. John blanched, suddenly furious. What in the world was she doing there? "Oh, you see who heard about our dinner together and offered to help?" his mother asked sweetly, gesturing to Lily. Lily, in turn, blushed and looked down, unable to meet John's gaze. "Lily is such a good woman. She made most of the dinner, you know, I was so busy with other chores." "Mrs. Rodgers, I didn't do nothing," Lily said very quietly. Brianna turned to John with a furrow between her brows, obviously confused. John shook his head. His anger made him quiet, no matter how much he wanted to holler. He had thought his parents were trying to mend fences, but it was clear that they had written a shorter letter to better convince him to come. They hadn't changed their minds at all. "Won't you taste the food, and tell Lily how good it is, John?" his mother prompted sweetly. She still hadn't looked Brianna in the face again, angry about the woman's presence and being quite obvious about it. His father was nothing but completely polite and nice, a preacher to his core, but while he was making small talk to Brianna, he hadn't looked John in the face. John couldn't bear it, not the betrayal nor the hypocrisy. He excused himself from the table, citing a sudden need for fresh air, and didn't catch Brianna's panicked expression at being left alone. It had dawned on Brianna as soon as she had stepped out of the wagon and caught sight of John's parents exactly what was going on in this family. It was obvious that John had escaped his parents and abhorred being controlled, and he had brought her over, both to Montana and to this dinner specifically as well, to show his parents that. Brianna should probably be more upset about it, but how could she ever be upset with John when she had come all the way here never intending to marry him at all? She knew that, rebellion or not, John was completely ready to make good on his promise and to indeed marry her. But she was upset at being left alone at the dinner table. Who did John think he was, leaving her at the table like this? She was his guest. This was his family. What was she supposed to do? What was she supposed to say? She caught the eyes of Lily, the woman who Betty Rodgers had brought here to apparently entice her son. They shared a strangely commiserating look. Both had been dragged into this. Lily was a little blonde thing that looked young and shy, and like she didn't want to be there at all. "And where is your family from?" Mr. Rodgers asked her, blandly polite. She was glad for the distraction and turned to him and away from the women. "I've never seen anyone with hair your color around these parts," he continued. "We come from Ireland, preacher," Brianna said, her spine straight and shoulders squared. She was proud of her parents and her heritage. "We came here to make a life like all good people did, though we settled in a city instead of coming west." "I see," the man said. There was a pause. Fortunately, it didn't take long for John to cool off and come back, sending Brianna an apologetic look. She sent him an annoyed look back, showing him that they would talk about him leaving her like that when they got back home. As always, John seemed strangely cheered up by her strong personality. Dinner was a decidedly uncomfortable affair. For the rest of the night, conversation was stilted. John was obviously trying not to give his mother or Lily Johnson any attention, while his father was clearly displeased with him and spoke to him in curt words. Neither of his parents were happy with Brianna's presence and what it meant. It was just another confirmation to Brianna that she and John were simply not meant to be together. Mrs. Rodgers sent her a dirty look while John was distracted, and Brianna sighed, exhausted with the evening already. She felt sad, as much as she had told herself not to have too many expectations for this affair. It felt silly and pointless when she had always meant to leave John, but a part of her had wanted to impress his family. How could they ever be together when his parents disapproved so strongly of her? She told herself firmly that she should stop dreaming and fantasizing about John. These folks didn't like her, and they didn't even know her whole truth, what she did for a living, her past, and what she had been planning to do to John. They'd certainly hate her if they knew. John caught her hand under the table, and she felt comforted by it. She couldn't not be, when his hand was warm, and he sent her a smile like he was promising to make up for all of this once they were back home. Mrs. Rodgers sent Brianna another look, her gaze flitting between John and Brianna suspiciously, as if she had an idea that there was something wrong with the picture in front of her. Betty Rodgers was no fool. She looked from her son to this Brianna McCarthy woman he had brought to their dinner table as if she were someone important to their family. She was beautiful, for certain, though not a tenth as beautiful as the lovely girl Lily who would be her actual daughter-in-law, not only because Betty wouldn't let her son just marry anybody, but also because she just knew this woman was trouble. There was something about Brianna that made Betty narrow her eyes. She watched as John and Brianna interacted. The woman was quiet and awkward when she wasn't being too loud and too strong with her opinions, and yet John looked at her with stars in his eyes. Betty noticed they were holding hands under the table like they were sweethearts or something. But she noticed the gaps in the woman's speech. How she didn't want to talk about her family, didn't want to say what she had been doing after they were killed, didn't want to say anything about her life on the ranch. Brianna was hiding something. Betty knew. She had bewitched John, but Betty wasn't so gullible. She needed to know more. "Brianna," she said once everyone was finished with dinner and the silence had stretched for too long. "Why don't you come to the kitchen with me for a moment? Dearest Lily already helped me, so you can help me now. Let's just get a start on the dishes." Brianna grimaced but got up without a word and followed Betty to the kitchen. She got to work without a sound, and Betty caught looks of her from the side of her eye. "Now tell me really," Betty said. "How's my son faring in this rancher's life? He seems so thin." "John's doing just fine," Brianna said without turning to her. "He's working hard and earning his keep like an honest man, and he really likes the ranch. And he's eaten just fine, Mrs. Rodgers. Don't go thinking we don't cook well for him." "I see," Betty said, a bit curt but unable not to be. Her son was supposed to grow up to be a preacher like his father. But despite that, Betty was glad to know he was enjoying the life he'd run off to have for a little while. "It's a good life," Brianna murmured. It sounded like the most honest thing Brianna had said the whole night, but for some reason, she seemed a bit ashamed of it. Chapter 7. Things were awkward between John and Brianna after the dinner with his parents. A day passed and then another, and the usually fiery woman seemed oddly subdued, sometimes spending minutes staring out the window, deep in thought. John felt ashamed of putting her through what had been a bad night and wanted to make it up to her. He just didn't know how. Then he remembered a thought he'd had the first day she had arrived at the ranch. "Brianna," he called, approaching her while she was washing the last of the dishes after a hearty breakfast. She turned to him and lifted one eyebrow in question. "Well," he continued, "I know things were hard the other day, with my parents. I'm really glad you went to meet them. I've been thinking. I know you got a lot of work, but don't you go tempting me into slacking off, Mr. Rodgers," Brianna interrupted, sending him a look. "No, of course not," John exclaimed with a smile. "But you work so much, it wouldn't be so bad to have a few free hours today, would it? We have a couple of horses, and they're very sweet. Have you ever ridden on a horse?" Brianna blinked at him, surprised. "I can't say I have, John. Why on earth would I get on a horse's back if there are wagons and carriages handy?" John grinned down at her. "Well, why don't you come with me after you're done with those dishes so I can show you? It's not hard to learn to ride a horse, and we can ride around the whole ranch. It's good to try something different for a while, you know. It'll be good." Brianna's look softened. John felt like his heart was going to burst in his chest, he was so smitten. Her eyes looked very bright in the sun, like new leaves in the beginning of spring, and she was looking at him like he had given her a precious gift she'd never known she wanted. "Oh, John," she murmured. Feeling emboldened by her response, John took a step closer. "Would you like to come?" he asked in a low voice, reaching out to circle her wrist with his fingers. She let him hold her, her skin smooth and cold from the water. "Yes, of course," she told him, gazing up at his eyes. John didn't know who leaned forward first, if he leaned down or if she went on her tiptoes, and it didn't matter. Their lips met in a quiet, unhurried kiss, and John felt warm down to his bones, happy to his core that he could cup her face with his palm, that he could close his eyes and enjoy the feeling of her body pressed so closely to his. He knew right then and there that he wanted to marry her. No doubts whatsoever. They pulled away after a moment, John's fingers sliding down Brianna's face until he was touching her chin softly, like he knew he had to take his hand but didn't want to stop touching her. "I'll be done with these dishes in a second," Brianna whispered. "All right." They shared a sweet smile. Brianna stared at the ceiling and despaired. It was dark and there was nothing to see, but her eyes refused to shut, and sleep refused to come. She felt so badly, she couldn't even name the feelings in her chest. They were just a black mass of something awful, like there was a demon sitting on her ribcage. She had fallen in love with John. She couldn't deal with any of this anymore. She had let things between them go too far. She had let everything go too far. She was too fond of Lydia, of Mr. Jennings and even Jake, of the ranch itself and even the work she did. Somehow, she ended up liking, even loving, this life. A part of her, selfish and tiny, childish and stupid, wanted to stay. But she knew she couldn't. She needed to walk away as soon as possible. She was a con woman. She was tricking John. She had been tricking him this whole time. He didn't know her at all. They would all hate her if they knew. She pressed the palms of her hands into her eyes, making color burst into her vision. Maybe if she said it enough to herself, she'd go back to being the smart woman she had always been. It didn't help things that Brianna had been invited to attend the Sunday church service the next weekend and then to have lunch with John's family again. She only hoped it wouldn't be as bad as the last meal she'd had with the Rodgers. Lunch was indeed as bad as the last meal with the Rodgers family. John's mother was suspicious, his father was reticent and full of disapproval, and Brianna was clearly uncomfortable, though at least his mother hadn't done them all the disservice of inviting Lily Johnson to share their meal this time. All in all, he thought, it was a miserable affair. And yet John's mood wouldn't sour. He felt like nothing in the world could make him stop feeling like everything was beautiful, and this was the best day of his life. He had a ring in his pocket, and he was going to propose to Brianna. He could imagine his future like only a man in love could, the dress Brianna would wear, the rooms they would share as a family, the little girl with Brianna's hair and eyes they would have together, the little boy who would look more like him, but be strong and confident like his mama. He knew without a doubt that Brianna would say yes. Not even the sour, sad looks his mother was sending him could dampen his spirits. He had his grandmother's ring in his pocket, the ring she had given her daughter, to pass on to a son. Truth was, his mother had given it to him months ago hoping that he would go on and propose to Lily. He had been very annoyed at the time, but now he was glad to have the ring. He already had it with him, otherwise he would have had to go back to his mother and beg her to hand it over to him, something he knew she would refuse to do. Now, she had no choice on the matter. So the lunch wasn't the best meal he had ever had, or any of them had ever had, but John's smile lit up the room enough for everybody, his happiness ballooning until it encompassed the whole house. The whole town. He caught Brianna's hand under the table again after they were done with their meal. She looked up at him, seeming surprised but pleased. John smiled and braced himself, squeezing her hand more to fortify himself than to comfort her. "Brianna McCarthy," he said, his voice loud and firm enough that the conversation between his parents petered out. They turned around to look at him, curious. He slid from his seat and knelt on the floor by her chair, and a gasp sounded from his mother. Brianna stared at him in shock, her hand going to her bosom and her mouth opening in a little O. He was lucky he had found her in the newspaper. He smiled, thanking the good Lord for the 100th time. "You've been at the ranch and in all our lives for a few months now," he started. "And all these months have been the best in my life. I know I'm a preacher's son, Brianna, and that means I should probably be better at this, but the truth is I'm not so good with words. I tried to write up something better for you, some kind of speech that would make you happy, some kind of grand gesture that would make your heart burst out of your chest, but the truth is, I couldn't do it. I'm a simple man, and really what I want to ask you only needs some very simple words. All I can think about is the life we can have together," he continued, his voice soft. "All I can think about is how happy we can be together. Will you marry me?" Tears welled up in Brianna's eyes, then started to fall. She was going to say yes. Brianna had known from the second John asked her. She had known from the second he knelt down, the second he said her name. She had known she would say yes for weeks now, truth be told, known it in her heart that if John asked, she would be unable to refuse him. She could hardly believe the sight in front of her, John Rodgers with his deep brown eyes kneeling before her, looking up at her like he was looking up at something out of this world, like he had never been happier in his life. The truth was that she wouldn't have been able to say no even if she had wanted to. She was in a serious bind, everyone's gazes were locked onto her, waiting for her reaction. She couldn't imagine what people would say if she denied John, the son of the town's preacher. The pressure was enough to make any woman perspire. She told herself that was the only reason she smiled a wide smile down at him, tears falling down her eyes, and said, "Oh, John. Only you would start all this saying you have no way with words only to make me cry like this." Of course, I will marry you. John's smile somehow widened even further, and he jumped up and drew her into a hug at once. She laughed and he did as well, both delighted as he straightened up and took her hand in his. She splayed her fingers wide, her heart beating inside her chest like it was trying to strangle her, and slowly but surely John Rodgers slid a solid, beautiful ring onto her finger. It was my grandmother's ring, he told her softly, holding her hand in his like it was something infinitely precious. It's yours now. I'm glad it's got a green stone, because it matches your eyes. It's like it was made just for you, Brianna. Oh, Brianna, she thought to herself, joyful but drowning in guilt. What have you done? Chapter 8. Life on the ranch went on. Wedding or not, ring or not, there was always work to do, and they all went back to it like it was their lot in life, and it was. Brianna was honestly glad for it. She thought that if she had no work and was left alone with her thoughts as she had often been with the other men she had stayed with, she would have gone crazy. As it was, she would probably have some time to process things and think about just what kind of hole she had dug herself. But it felt like no time at all later, before Brianna could wrap her mind around John's speech and the fact that she had said yes and what it all meant, when a letter from Betty arrived and punched through Brianna's plans to remain quiet. In it, John's mother invited her to join her for tea with a few of the ladies from church. Brianna clutched at the paper, unsure what to do. She didn't want to go at all, still mentally exhausted from the past week. She didn't think she would be able to stand Mrs. Rodgers' jabs for long before she ran out of the house screaming. But really, what could she do but go? It'll be fine, Lydia told her firmly. You'll get to know your future husband's mother and the neighbors. I know you all don't really get along, what with, and I don't mean to bad-mouth the nice preacher and his wife, but what with John's parents being a bit too invested in his life, so to speak. But that doesn't make it so they're not your family now, Brianna. It'll be good to go. Aren't you glad for an excuse to duck out of work for one afternoon? No, Brianna wasn't glad for an excuse. But as always, Lydia knew best, and so Brianna went. At least it was going to happen in the Rodgers house, and she had been there before, so it was a slightly familiar place and that made her feel a little more comfortable. She didn't know how she would feel if she were walking into a complete stranger's house. Brianna smiled at Betty when she answered the door and managed not to trip when she walked in, suddenly clumsy in her nervousness. "In you come, girl," Betty said, surprisingly demure. "We're all gathered at the table. Please come and sit down and chat for a while. The tea and snacks will be served soon." Brianna obediently sat down and worked to get to know all the women. There was Mrs. Johnson, Lily Johnson's mother, and her sister, Mrs. Cadence. There was Mrs. Turner, Mrs. Perkins, and Mary, who insisted on being called by her first name. And of course, there was Mrs. Betty Rodgers, Brianna's future mother-in-law. Brianna felt strange, sitting there and chatting with these women. Some of them had traveled far to come to the West like Brianna had, others had come in caravans with their entire families. They were all older than her, married with children already. Brianna felt a bit small, and much like the imposter she was. She was getting a bit desperate to hear an answer from her next-con victim. She hadn't completely closed that door, giving herself an escape route, if needed. Leaving for some rich rancher in Texas sounded appealing when Brianna was faced with the fact that staying would mean weathering Betty Rodgers, and just how much she disliked Brianna. All the tea parties and church services Brianna would have to spend in awkward silence or even more awkward polite conversation reared up to haunt her. "So, how is your dear Lily?" Mrs. Rodgers sweetly asked Mrs. Johnson. Brianna sighed, hiding her face behind her cup, pretending she hadn't heard the words. One of the reasons that Brianna felt so out of place was that these women obviously knew each other very well, and often started to talk of things that they all were familiar with, but which Brianna had no idea about, or was interested in fact. "Oh, did you hear about the trucker's boy the other day?" Mrs. Turner said to Mary in a conspiratorial tone of voice. "I heard he stayed 2 days inside the saloon and was thrown out of it onto the street, still drunk out of his mind. The Finnegan girl is expecting again," Mrs. Johnson commented, to many happy murmurs. I'm sure it'll be a boy this time. Your daughter was beautiful at her wedding last week, Mrs. Cadence. Mrs. Perkins said. I wish I could have had a dress that beautiful for my wedding. Brianna, Betty Rodgers said, placing a hand on her shoulder, her voice low enough that the other women wouldn't hear her. Brianna tensed at the unwelcome touch. Come with me to the kitchen. We'll get some snacks for us all to eat while I make more tea. Brianna almost grimaced, but contained it in time, and got up without a word. She was glad to be out of the table and away from the chatter of women she didn't know, but she felt apprehensive over what it was Betty wanted from her, and Betty did indeed corner her as soon as they were alone. I know you're keeping a secret, the older woman snapped, grabbing Brianna's elbow in a tight grip. Brianna gasped. What does she know? She wondered, desperate. What has she figured out? How much of Brianna's life had the woman discovered? I don't know what it is, she went on, and Brianna sighed in relief, though it was short-lived as Betty continued talking. I will do anything to protect my son. Anything, Miss McCarthy. You're not a mother. You don't know what I would do for my son. I'm going to ensure he marries the girl that he should. Mrs. Johnson and I have been planning their wedding for months. Well, John asked for my hand, not hers. Brianna snapped back. But it was a weak thing. Betty's grip felt bruising, and Brianna felt bad. She knew the game was up. The worst thing in the world was that when she left, she would hurt John exactly and as terribly as this woman feared she would. John is a silly man right now. He doesn't know what's right, Betty said with a shake of her head and finally let go of Brianna's arm. I'll work this out, see if I don't, girl. I won't let you hurt my boy. It was ironic, Brianna thought, that Betty would get exactly what she wanted and what she most feared at the same time. Brianna would leave, and John would be able to marry someone else, but it would probably break his heart and make him miserable. He was too much an honest man, and she knew he really loved her. Brianna went back to the ranch feeling utterly exhausted. It was just the end of afternoon, with the sky darkening and the bugs beginning to crawl out of their hiding holes, and it meant everyone was done with work and back under the roof of home. Mr. Jennings and Jake were talking to each other loudly about how valuable it would be to buy another horse from their neighbor, whose mare had just had twin foals, even though they didn't really need another horse. Lydia was fretting about all the dirt and loose grass and leaves they were tromping into the house. John was quietly and dutifully wiping his boots down at the porch, shaking his feet so he wouldn't dirty up the house. Brianna's fiancé was a kind, considerate man. She sighed to herself, shaking the thoughts out of her head. Brianna, hello, John said, brightening up when he caught sight of her. I was just wondering if I would have to go rescue you. I can deal with some old ladies, John, Brianna told him with a shake of her head. Was everything all right? He asked, his tone of voice softening. Of course, it was, she told him with a smile. I drank so much tea I think I'll never want to drink it again. How was your day? Tiring, but good, John told her, then blinked as he remembered something. Oh. Here, a letter came for you. It arrived almost as soon as you left earlier today. Brianna's heart leapt to her throat. She snatched the envelope from John's hand and quickly read the front so she could see who it was from. It was indeed from the rich rancher who was finally replying to her. I see, she said. Thank you for saving it for me. I'll be off to read it then. Who is it from? John asked, curious. Just a friend from the city, Brianna said, lying through her teeth, and fled to her room. She sank down heavily on the bed and read the letter. She was relieved when she saw she had received a positive response and even a train ticket so she could make her way to Texas to meet this Mr. Rubel. He seemed like the perfect kind of man for her type of con. He was older and rich, and he lived on a property that was isolated. Nor did he have family living with him. Although the thought of going back to interacting only with awful men was disheartening, it was also relieving. It was a comfort, because it was familiar. It had been her life for the past 5 years, before she arrived at the Jennings ranch. This letter was a sign that it was time to go, no matter how much it would break her heart to leave John. A knock on her door startled her out of her thoughts. It was John, who was looking into the room a little hesitantly, like he didn't want to step into her room without permission but was very curious about what he'd see. "Everything all right with your friend?" "Yes, everything's perfect," Brianna said, looking away. "Did you need something, John?" "I was wondering if you wanted to talk about the wedding," he said, a smile growing on his face. Brianna's smile felt brittle. "Of course, John," she said. "Anything you want." Chapter 9. Brianna sat at the breakfast table and picked at the food without eating. "Brianna, dear, are you all right?" Lydia asked, refilling Brianna's still nearly full cup of tea like more tea was going to make everything better. "You aren't eating anything. Do you want something different?" "No. I'm feeling a bit sick," Brianna said, the lie coming out easy even though she hated lying to any of these people she had grown so fond of. "I don't mean to duck out of work, Lydia, but do you think I could stay in a bit today?" "Of course," Lydia exclaimed, seeming almost offended that Brianna could suggest she wouldn't give her a day to rest. "You stay here while we work, and don't fret, John. You go off to work and your girl will be right as rain when you come back at the end of the day." John sent her a worried look, but none of them fretted too much when they left. Lydia grasped Brianna's hands in hers and told Brianna to take it easy and drink more tea. Brianna, of course, wasn't actually sick. She needed to pack her belongings and she had a train to catch soon. She would be out of town before the Jennings came back and realized that she wasn't there anymore. It was a coward's way out, but Brianna didn't have the heart to say goodbye in person. She went to her room and got the bag she had arrived with months before and started filling it with what she owned. It wasn't much and she tried not to linger too much on the things she had accumulated while staying on the ranch, like the dark green dress Lydia had lent her and eventually given to her. Then she sat and wrote a letter. "Dear John, I'm sure you must be confused with why I'm not home. I'm sorry for all this. I'm not the person you think I am, John, the person you wanted to marry. I didn't tell all of you what my life was like. Truth is, I was taken in by a con man after my parents died, and I spent the last 5 years tricking people out of their money. That's been my life's work. The man who took me and tricked me and abandoned me in New York, and I placed an ad as a mail-order bride because I was searching for my next victim. The agency tricked me, too. They said you were a wealthy rancher. That's why I came here. I can't stay anymore. I can't bear to with all this weighing on me. I'm sorry for every pain I'll cause you, but I'm sure you'll find a good, honest woman to marry. I won't lie to you anymore. I have grown to love you. But I can't stay. I'm sorry. With love. Brianna." She wiped her tears away before they could stain the paper. Brianna took one step out of the door and stumbled into Lydia. "Oh," she said with a gasp, almost tripping as she stepped back. "Brianna?" Lydia exclaimed, catching her hands to stop her from falling. "I'm so sorry, girl, I didn't see you there. I came back to get my hat. God knows I can't stand this sun without it for long, but why are you leaving out the front door like this?" Brianna winced, her eyes veering away in shame. She knew precisely the moment that Lydia caught sight of the bag in her hand. The woman gasped, took a step back, and looked at Brianna with horrified eyes. "Brianna, you're not leaving," she cried. Brianna backed away, trying to escape from the sight in front of her, but she couldn't. She had hoped to slip away, to write all her goodbyes in a letter so she wouldn't have to suffer, but now Lydia was right here, and it was impossible for Brianna to ignore the fact that she was never going to see the people who had become her family again. "Oh, Lydia," Brianna choked out, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry. I'm so very sorry. I can't bear to tell you anything right now. I can't look at your face. Thank you for making me feel so welcome. Thank you for giving me a family for the first time in so many years." "You can't," Lydia tried, shaking her head. "I'm going," Brianna interrupted, and pressed her letter and the ring of John's grandmother into Lydia's hands. "Please give this to John, and tell him, oh, I don't know. Tell him I'm sorry. I don't know what else to say." I have to go, now. You can't leave us like this, Lydia protested, shaking her head. It was as if she were losing her daughter instead of a guest, and it broke Brianna's heart. You can't leave John like this. At least tell me where you're going, please, or else I think I'll die of worry. I'm taking the next train for Texas, Brianna told her, even though everything in her said it would be best to have a cleaner break between them. But please don't tell John. I can't bear it. She picked up her bag again and ran off, leaving Lydia standing on the porch with her hand over her mouth and tears sliding down her cheeks. Brianna arrived at the station sometime later, just in time to rest for a bit before she had to board the train. She found a little nook to sit in and sip some water. She watched as people passed her by, on their way in and out of the station. She pressed her palms to her eyes until her tears stopped threatening to fall. She had cried enough with Lydia, made enough of a fool of herself, and she didn't want to do it anymore. This was who she was, she reminded herself. She had broken many hearts before she had broken John's. But never before had she broken her own. Chapter 10. Lydia didn't stay on the porch long. She was a rancher's wife with a fully grown son. She was no fool and she knew just when to act. She got back up on her horse and rode out to the fields, going as fast as she could to find John. She wouldn't stand for this, wouldn't stand for that poor girl going away from them like the devil was snapping at her ankles. She had been too shocked to keep Brianna from leaving, but God forbid that she wouldn't have the sense to send that girl's man after her. Lydia couldn't bear the thought of Brianna leaving them like that, with no real goodbye or any explanation. She shivered when she imagined the lot of them arriving home after a day's work to find the house empty and quiet. Her first thought was that Brianna's sickness would have gotten worse, that the girl had probably gone into town for a doctor's help. Though now she doubted Brianna had been sick at all. John and Jake were standing under the shade of a tree and drinking some water when Lydia spotted them. Lydia rode to their sides, relieved that she wouldn't need to ride out to the middle of the herd to try and find them. "John," she exclaimed, getting down from the horse. "Come here." "Mrs. Jennings?" John asked, clearly surprised by her sudden appearance. "What's wrong? You dashed back to the house and now you're back. Is everything all right with Brianna? Did she get worse?" Jake clasped his friend's shoulder, clearly worried, too. "That girl is on her way to board the next train to Texas right now," Lydia told him, shoving the letter Brianna had given her and the ring into John's hands, who took them, shocked. "I don't know what happened, John, only that I opened the front door and we knocked our heads together, because she was just on her way out. I couldn't stop her." "Brianna left?" John asked, out of words, staring at the paper in his hands like he didn't even know what it was. "John," Lydia said, swatting him on the arm. "Pull yourself together. I just told you your fiancé is on the next train to Texas. Get on this horse and go get her." He blinked, then stood straighter. "Right," he said. "She just agreed to marry me. I can't and won't lose her now." "That's right," Lydia said, proud. "But you might want to read her letter first." Lydia turned to talk to her son, and John ripped open the letter. His eyes quickly scanned the paper and widened in shock, so he went back to slowly read it over again. In a few seconds, he learned everything that Brianna had apparently hidden from him for months, like the fact that she had come there not because she thought they could build a good life together, but because of money. She had come to him because of money. And yet even as a logical part of him said he should focus on that, focus on the fact that she was a con and had come to trick him and steal from him and that she had lied to him so much, he just couldn't do it. This was all important, of course, but his eyes read and reread the last lines she had written instead. "I can't stay anymore. I can't bear to with all this weighing on me. I'm sorry for every pain I'll cause you, but I'm sure you'll find a good, honest woman to marry. I won't lie to you anymore, I have grown to love you. But I can't stay." They weren't the words of a trickster. They weren't the words of someone fleeing because they were a bad person. These were the words of a repentant person. The words of a heartbroken woman, fleeing not from an unsatisfactory situation, but from her own guilt. Yes, she had initially been out to con him, but things had changed. Maybe she had meant the letter to be a final goodbye, a severing of their ties, a way to shock him into not caring that she was leaving, but it had the opposite effect on him. John read her words and felt buoyed, certain now, more than ever, of her love for him, happy that now he knew everything she had been hiding. Brianna was a proud, confident woman, and she was probably dismayed at growing to love him when she hadn't planned to, but love him she did, and John was going to get his future wife back. "Here, Mrs. Jennings," John exclaimed, tossing the letter at her. "Keep the letter and read it, see what you think." "I'm pretty sure." "I don't need to read no letter, Johnny," Mrs. Jennings said, though he saw her clutching at the paper, curious about what Brianna had said. "I saw the look in her eyes, I know exactly what is going on. There was love there, John Rodgers. What I saw there was real. Now, go get your girl." "Yes," John said with a sharp grin, throwing his leg over the horse she had just ridden. He settled into the saddle and kicked the horse's side. He galloped to the road that would lead him to town. Lydia and Jake watched as he left. Jake leaned over his mother's shoulder, trying to peer at the letter in her hands. "Well, straighten it out, let us read what she said," he said when his mother made no move to read it. "Jake," she scolded. "We're not the type of folks who would go around shoving our noses at other people's business." But she was already lifting it up so they could read it. Jake only laughed and kissed the side of her head affectionately. John had ridden a third of the way to town when the thought hit him that maybe he wouldn't get there on time. Trains were a much faster way to travel than horseback, and Mrs. Jennings said Brianna was taking the very next train to Texas, and that was before she had to ridden out to the ranch to find him. John had taken the time to read the letter, and now he had to ride all the way to town and to the train station. He had taken the train once or twice before, and he knew sometimes they were late, and passengers had to wait around the station for a while, but what if it wasn't late? What if it had already left? He had no idea what the schedule was. And of course, Brianna would have gone by foot to the station, unless she had a ride lined up, but either way, it wouldn't have taken a great deal of time. What if she was off in the horizon already, far away, where he couldn't get to her? He didn't think he had money to buy a train ticket on him, and he couldn't really abandon the Jennings and the ranch and leave them to do his share of the work while he went running around Texas looking for Brianna. He had to find her now. "I am going to find her now," he swore to himself as he rode. There was no other option he would accept. He arrived at the station panting, out of breath, and feeling like his legs were only barely holding him onto his horse. He didn't even get down from it as he approached the station. He galloped to the door and shouted at the first person he saw who looked like they worked there. "Hey," he said, his voice strong. "You, in the uniform. Has the train for Texas left already?" "Yeah, it has," the man answered, bored. "Left some minutes ago. You're gonna have to catch the next one. Come back in 2 days." John cursed under his breath, uttering words that his preacher father would kick him out of the house for if he heard them. He gripped at the reins with white-knuckled hands and turned around, ready to gallop for the very train Brianna had taken. He wasn't giving up on her. He rejoiced when he saw the train in the distance, and with a scream of exhaustion and frustration, he worked his horse until they were close enough to the big metal monster for John to be able to touch it. He moved until he was close to the rear car and the platform there and thought to himself a bit hysterically that no, he wasn't going to do that. He wasn't crazy enough to do that. But Brianna was in there. He rode as close as he dared and leapt off his horse and into the train. His legs shook when he landed, aching from the bones of his toes up to his hips, and he got the breath punched out of him. He fell like a sack of rocks onto the harsh metal floor. His horse neighed, rising on his hind legs, and John watched as the animal was left behind by the train. John had made it. He was on the train. He let out a cry of victory and stood up on shaky limbs. He picked up the pace and hurried inside and through the aisles, head swiveling around, looking for that shock of instantly recognizable red hair. "Brianna," he shouted, his voice thick. "Brianna, where are you? Brianna." He ran through the entire train, jumping from one car to the next until he became nearly frantic. He was sure Brianna was on this train, he was sure. She had to be there somewhere. Had he misunderstood somehow? Was Brianna quickly speeding away on another train, off to another place entirely, leaving him here going to God knew where, alone? Brianna, he called out, desperate. John, came a quiet, utterly shocked voice from the other side of the car. John felt his knees buckle in relief. Brianna, he breathed out. He ran to her side and collapsed next to her, completely breathless. John Rodgers, what are you doing here? She asked. She grabbed his arm and put a hand on his cheek. She looked into his eyes as if she thought he was sick. How did you even get on this train? And didn't you read my letter? What are you doing here? John caught her hand, suddenly terrified that she would lean away from him. He looked deeply into her eyes. Brianna McCarthy, he said, his voice firm and strong. I asked you to marry me and you said yes. I read your letter, Brianna, I know your secrets now. I know you had your reasons, but none of it matters to me. He plucked his grandmother's ring from his pocket and lifted it to Brianna. Her bright green eyes were wide, and her mouth had dropped open. She was gripping at his arm like it was the only thing holding her onto this world. What? She said in a small voice, his Brianna, speaking in a small voice. John couldn't bear it. I love you, he told her, simply but truthfully, and smiled. All you wrote, it doesn't matter to me because I know you love me. I asked you to marry me and you said yes. It was the happiest day of my life. This ring is yours. Brianna let go of him and put both hands over her mouth. Tears welled up in her eyes. Oh, John, I can't, she said, shaking her head, looking confused and relieved and sad. After everything, I can't. But I forgive you, John told her. For all of it. Her face screwed up, and she started to cry. John's heart broke for her and he sat up straighter so he could hold her to his chest, splaying his hands wide over her back, protective. It's all right, he murmured. You can't just do this, she wailed. You can't just come here and tell me you forgive me just like that, give me the ring back just like that. I lied to you and ran away from you. John grinned at her. But I found you, didn't I? Yes, she said, leaning back and wiping at her face with a hand. You silly man. You silly, wonderful man, you foolish. But you love me, he interrupted. Tears sprang up to her eyes again. I do, she whispered. John, I want to stay. Then stay, he said. Stay and marry me. She smiled. It was a wide, true smile, bright and as relieved as it was joyful. Yes, she said. With all my heart, with everything in me, yes. I will stay. Chapter 11. It took them a long time to get back home. They both left the train at the first town that passed on their way, where they managed to get train tickets back home because Brianna had some money and a kind woman at the station helped them out, sympathizing when she heard their dramatic tale. By the time they arrived at the ranch, night had fallen, and everything was dark and quiet. It wasn't dark and quiet for long, though, since Mrs. Jennings quickly burst out of the front door with a candle in her hands as soon as she heard their borrowed horses approaching. Brianna McCarthy, she called out and started to cry when she saw that Brianna was indeed by John's side. You infuriating woman. How could you do this to me? How could you leave and worry me like this? I'm sorry, Lydia, Brianna said demurely, uncharacteristically solemn and almost shy. John helped her down from the horse and steadied her when Mrs. Jennings ran forward and nearly knocked Brianna down with a hug. The candle wobbled on its plate and John took it from her. I can't believe you did that, Mrs. Jennings wailed. I'm sorry, Brianna repeated in a voice thick with tears. She was hugging Mrs. Jennings back just as hard. I'm so sorry. I was lost. I was confused and so afraid. I was so sure you would all hate me if you knew. How could I ever look you in the face? You know now how I led my life in New York City, don't you? I didn't want to hurt John, but I couldn't. I thought I couldn't make him happy. You make us all happy, John told her firmly, liberating her from Mrs. Jennings so he could sweep her into his own hug. We're all glad you're here. Oh, dear Lord, Mrs. Jennings said, pinching the bridge of her nose. The two of you must be exhausted. Come in, you fools. I will heat up some soup for you. Even though it had been the most exhausting day of her life, Brianna still sat with John on the back porch, unable to sleep. She knew he was tired, her fiancé, and how strange it was to think of him like that, honestly and truthfully. His day had been as exhausting as hers, because he had already been working on the ranch, then had ridden on horseback all the way to town and after her train. But he seemed in no hurry to go to bed. He had hardly let go of her hand since she had accepted his ring again and his proposal to marry her. Your mother didn't like me because she thought I was hiding something, Brianna told him, breaking the silence that had settled between them. I never said anything and never complained because she was right. John chuckled. Mothers usually are right, he allowed, amused. Your parents hate me, she said in a small voice. That won't change just because you forgave me. They'll be angry, he told her honestly. But they'll eventually understand, and don't you sit and spend your days wondering what they think of you or us. But the truth is, I know it's stressful. My mother and father have me as an only son, and it made them too protective. But it doesn't matter to me anymore. I'm sorry you'll have to suffer through my mother being rude to you at her tea parties for a while, but it won't last, and soon she'll see how wonderful you are. Brianna felt a blush rise to her face. Oh, John, don't you joke like that. I'm trying to talk about something important. She'll never think I'm wonderful. I'm not joking, he told her with a grin. She'll fall in love with you, you see, and then pretend for the rest of her lives that she was never rude to you at all. It startled a laugh out of Brianna. They two of them smiled at each other, relaxing in each other's company. John leaned down and caught her lips in a kiss again, and Brianna relaxed in his arms and felt, after so long, finally home. John's parents heard Brianna's story the next day, and it broke their hearts in a manner that truly surprised both John and Brianna. His parents hadn't imagined that the fiery young woman had been so sad, so confused, so hurt and alone all this time. They staunchly believed her coming to them had all been in God's plan. With only a small measure of reluctance, they accepted her with open arms. A week later, John and Brianna were married on the ranch, and John's father oversaw the traditional wedding ceremony with a proud smile on his usually stern face. The end. Thank you for listening to this heartwarming story by Susannah Calloway. You can be assured that all her books are clean and wholesome. To find other romances by Susannah Calloway, as well as the other authors at Tika House Publishing, visit www.tikahousepublishing.com. Remember to hit like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next Susannah Calloway Western romance.